Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting episode of the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 5 days a week for your listening pleasure. My very special guests today are Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore, and we're going to be talking about Christianity and how it was an invented technique of mind control in and of itself. Joe Atwill is the producer and author of Caesar's Messiah. As a youth in Japan, Atwill attended a Jesuit military academy where most of the school day was spent studying Greek, Latin, and the Bible. In later years, he continued studying hundreds of books on the origins of Christianity, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. Together with Robert Eisman, Atwill wrote a paper on the actual dating of the scrolls. Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus, was published by Ulysses Press in 2006, becoming the best-selling work of religious history in the US in 2007. Its German translation has also achieved #1 bestseller status. So, Joe, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me, and it's good to hear your voice again, Vinny.
You know, I like hearing my voice too. That's kind of why I become a radio show host. And Ryan, also welcome to you.
Hi, Vinny.
All right. So, Joe, if you wouldn't mind launching us off and taking this show where you'd like it to go.
Sure. Well, in the next month, October the 19th in London at the Conroy Theatre, we're going to be putting on a seminar. There'll be myself, other scholars. Ryan will be there, Ryan Gilmore. And we're going to be showing the Caesar's Messiah documentary, and we're going to be putting on a presentation of evidence showing that Christianity was, in fact, an invention of the Roman Caesars. And that even though it looks like a religion and people see it as such, in fact, it is a propaganda device. That's really what it has been in effect. And that it was put on to the European mind to make the feudal system, which was a system of slavery that the Caesars enacted, have the appearance of being a religious system. In other words, the serfs, which is just another word for slaves, wouldn't rebel against the system because they believed that there was a religious basis for their servitude, that the head of the feudal system, which was the Pope, the Pontiff Maximus, was the representative of Jesus here on earth, and that therefore they had to follow his instructions. The title Pontiff Maximus was just one of the many titles that the Caesars held, and the location of the Vatican, the Palatine Hill, is where the actual palace of the Flavian Caesars was. So you can see that they set up their system of mind control and didn't even bother really to change the title that they held or where they lived. They just put it into effect and told everybody to shut up and obey. So
is this where the term having a Flavian disregard for something comes from?
Yeah, I think it is actually. So this is really what we're going to try to do, is just so, look, the religion is obviously fake. We can show it's fake. We can show the character Jesus Christ is fictional. And we can show that the Bible has a very destructive effect. Ryan will get into this a little bit later, but the Bible has a really destructive effect in that it brings sociopaths into a kind of justification for violence. When you look at our history in a broad stroke, you can see this is in fact the case, that wherever this religion is, that you end up with these violent wars. And we also believe that the current situation with all of these endless wars in the Middle East, that at the basis of them, you're going to find the Bible. It may seem like there's oil and all these other issues, and they are there. They are real issues. But one of the very fundamental issues is just this false history that the Bible continues to confuse people with. It's sort of like when you put bad information into a computer, And then hundreds of instruction sets later, it just continues to misfunction. It doesn't matter what you do, the darn thing just won't put out good data. Our minds are like that, Vinny. We just have so much bad information inside of us that we can't think clearly about how government operates and about the motivations for government.
Computer programmers have a saying, it's called garbage in, garbage out. Doesn't matter what you put into the computer, if it's garbage, you won't get anything good out of it.
Right.
Well, one of the garbage programs or viruses is the idea that God writes books. And as soon as that idea is accepted, what do people do with the contradictions in the Bible? What do people do with the wide range of moral behavior displayed in the Bible? People will do different things with it. But one of the things that happens is this kind of deification of the psychopathic parts of the Bible that people find it hard to criticize, especially Christians who know from the story that Jesus was a practicing Jew and he revered parts of the Hebrew Bible, and so there's a contradiction there. If this very model of spirituality admired the Hebrew Bible, and that has very psychopathic parts to it, like genocide, calling for genocide, killing children. It's hard to reconcile that if you think God wrote the Bible. I'd like to see more people seeing that spirituality comes from within. I mean, a book can inspire that spirituality, but to totally externalize it and put it on a book this isn't serving this culture anymore.
I've always wondered, where's the integrity, the intelligence, and the forethought to base your entire life upon the writings of a singular book?
Yeah, well, there just isn't any, and it's just bad thinking from the very beginning. The way that was achieved was by stating that the book came from God, and therefore you shouldn't look at other books because this is the book that came from God. But if you actually have a focused analysis of the material in the Bible, you'll see that, as Ryan pointed out, that much of it is literally psychopathic. So this can't be coming from God. It's impossible. It's contradictory. So since the book doesn't come from God, it comes from men. And therefore, your point that you shouldn't base your life upon it is absolutely correct. And it's the only logical way to approach the situation. Just going back to when the U.S. got into this absolute catastrophe in the Middle East, which was supposed to be over quickly and now is led to a point where World War III is literally on the table and no end in sight, of course, to the conflict. If you remember way back when, to 2001, when Bush started all this activity, he used the Bible as his primary basis. Bush actually went to the French prime minister at the time, which name was Chirac, and said that you needed to be part of this war because it was Gog and Magog. Now, Chirac smiled politely and nodded, and when Bush left, he turned to his colleague and said, "What was that? What was he talking about?" He had no idea. They had to go and get a Bible scholar. And this was reported in a number of French newspapers, and I believe German newspapers as well, but it never got into the U.S. media for some reason. But what the Bible scholar told Chirac was, it appears that the American president believes that the book of Revelation's prophecy, which end up with the apocalypse and the population of the planet being reduced to 144,000, that this war in the Middle East is going to lead to the second coming of Jesus and the apocalypse. Now, this was well vetted. In other words, this wasn't just a rumor, but it actually was corroborated in a journalistic fashion, and appears to be true. It was never denied by the U.S. press corps that surrounds the president, and yet it is absolutely clear grounds for removing Bush on the grounds he's insane. But this couldn't occur in the United States because you would have had to have cut across the bias that the Bible is the Word of God, and that you would have offended all of the millions of people that actually do believe the book is, in fact, somehow divinely inspired. And so, therefore, these wars began. And now here we are today with so many boats, men of war in the Mediterranean Ocean, that you could walk from Cyprus to the shores of Syria without getting wet. If one of them has some kind of computer glitch, then World War III breaks out. And it all began because we didn't have the system and the courage to say, you know, people that believe in this stuff are nuts. And this is just crazy. And what we're looking for are politicians that want to put off the apocalypse, not ones that want to help bring it about.
Joe, what would you say to the objection that, what George Bush was talking about, that's not true Christianity?
Well, I would say that it's just easy to always cherry pick what Christianity is. I think we need, as citizens, to just judge it as it has existed historically, as it has affected us as a historical element, and that is, in fact, as a catastrophe.
Can I interject here something? Because this reminds me, so many times of the debate of, but that's not real socialism.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, well, you exterminated a whole bunch of people in China, exterminated a whole bunch of people in Cambodia, exterminated a whole bunch of people in Russia. But that's not real socialism. And
we just haven't done socialism correctly yet.
Yeah. Right. So
that's the objection. Right.
So would it be fair to say that we haven't done Christianity correctly yet, even though it's got a playbook?
Right. And the thing is that, we must judge these social programs by their effect, particularly when they have a history. And in Christianity's case, it's just been an absolute catastrophe. It was the mind control device of the feudal system. It lasted for over 1,000 years. It literally operated as the enslavement device for the entire European population. And this is for 1,000 years.
I'd like to read a quote. Joe, sorry. I'd like to read a quote from the book Lost Science of Money by Stephen Zarlinga. This is a really good quote concerning literalism and the Bible. Quote, "Looking at the Bible as the literal word of God inevitably limits the mind's ability to use the full methodology available to human beings for gaining knowledge. One must not surrender one's mind and soul in that way, no matter what the promised benefits. The mind must never be abandoned, neither to superstition nor to any seductive ism claiming to offer salvation in alternative form." Unquote.
What is salvation? What is to be saved?
It's seductive, this external savior. And I think that a lot of people project their spirituality onto the Jesus character, and they give Jesus too much credit for something that's coming from within. And because they externalize it, they're giving over, as Zarlinga says here, surrendering one's mind and soul.
So does that mean if people actually, instead of operating under the belief that, say, Jesus is real and he did all this stuff and he was the Son of God and he was the only one that could do that, if they say Jesus was an example of what human beings are capable of and you can do it too if only you actually really went hardcore and started practicing and doing so on and so forth, would that make a difference?
No. The idea that an individual could have a wonderful spiritual experience with Christianity is not what we're debating. It's whether or not it is a tool that government can use. The individual experiences with Jesus are, from a political and historical perspective, just irrelevant. What difference does it make? I mean, there are wonderful spiritual experiences with every religion, because there are in fact individuals who are going to have these spiritual moments, and if whether or not they are Islam or Hindu
or even just using magic mushrooms.
Zoroastrianism. I mean, though that isn't the question. The question is how does a religion operate politically? What is, in particularly in the case of Christianity, is what is it doing now politically? What effect has Christianity had on the situation in the Middle East? And I think that any clear-minded description of that would indicate it has been very instrumental in creating a situation that is literally catastrophic. So those who want to have these moments with Jesus, please do so. But for the rest of us who are worried about the existence of humanity, we have this other problem in that the religion, it can be used and has been used and is being used as a political tool to justify this kind of really destructive behavior. So we want to expose the religion's origin so that the way that it has been used politically will be clear to people, and that therefore they will know how to prevent it from having effect in our current political situation.
Well, this is the reason why the Founding Fathers decided to separate church and state, maybe because they feared the possibility of the church taking over the country.
Well, that, and of course, because it makes people, balls crazy. And then you have this irrational component. I mean, look, civilization is very fragile. And the more murderous or crazy impulse that has, entered into the minds of the constituents who make up the democratic vessel that we all share, means the more polluted it is and the worse the result of the government becomes. And I think that Ryan's point is really profound, that the Bible attracts sociopaths.
Well, let's get into this more after the break. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show on AmericanFreedomRadio.com, and we'll be right back after the break at the VinnieEastwoodShow.com is where you can find the archives to this one. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 5 days a week for your listening pleasure. Now, of course, the intent of the show is not to offend people or anything of that nature. It's just to really give you the perspective from a lot of different points of view, because it's only if you listen to many, many different points of view and lots of different frames of references that you get something called perspective. If you don't have perspective, you probably won't know where you're going in life. My very special guests are Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore. And you had a point that you made over the break, is that you don't want to just specifically bag Christianity, but all the Abrahamic religions. Abrahamic, ladies and gentlemen, is something that you lash between two trees and lie on while you're having a religious ceremony, by the way. So anyway, what was this about the Abrahamic religions you wanted to talk about, Ryan?
Well, Joe was talking a lot about Christianity, and I think it would be good for Joe to talk about the context of, in his theory, where Christianity came from and what the Romans were concerned about at the time.
Right. Well, Rome was battling a Messianic movement in the first century. This is really what was the basis for the religion that we know of Christianity. They attempted to essentially tone down a xenophobic and militaristic version of Christianity and replace it with one that could essentially just exist within the Roman Empire. And this kind of goes to the heart of the problem that even today we're seeing with Christianity, is that you can see in the Hebrew Bible and in the Dead Sea Scroll literature, the literature of the Messianic movement that was fighting against Rome in the first century, you can see many examples of a sort of clear-minded heroism in the face of overwhelming colonization and of overwhelming, just military force to occupy your land. But the problem is that the literature comes from warfare. Even long before the Romans showed up in Judea, the Hebrew Bible documents battles between the Philistines and the people who lived in Jericho. And there was this constant warfare that the Israelites were engaged in. And always there was justification in the literature for their taking Gentile slaves, for revenge against the Gentiles. And basically, this is so chronic throughout the literature that if someone has psychopathic tendencies, that the literature itself creates justification for it. Now, moving forward in the New Testament, in the story that the Romans developed about Jesus, you have exactly the same thing, except now it's the Jews are the bad guys and the Gentiles are the ones who are given a kind of justification for violence against Jews. And in the New Testament, probably the most influential statement in it is where the Jews demand that Jesus will be crucified. They force the Roman magistrate Pontius Pilate into doing it, even though he's trying to wash his hands and get away from the act. And the Jews cry out that his blood will be on our hands and on our children's hands. Now, that lovely sentiment was placed by the Romans into the book, and throughout history has been a justification for sociopaths to kill Jews, just in the same way that the material in the Hebrew Bible has been justification for Jews to feel no concern whatsoever if it's only Gentiles that they're doing financial or physical damage to. These are the sociopaths I'm referring to. Going forward into the Quran, I'll just let the Islamic scholars deal with that on their own, but I would say that it needs to have some explanation as far as the military activity of the purported leader. And I think that just any real review of the Abrahamic traditions in general will see that it has produced a justification for war more often than it does anything else. So I think that's why the work that we're trying to bring forward in London at the venue on the 17th at the Conroy Theatre.
Sorry, the 19th at Conway Hall.
At Conway Hall, will hopefully be seen as both timely, if the world is not destroyed by then, and also interesting and valuable, that people will be able to come away from the event thinking more clearly about the present, because they'll have a better understanding of how governments use these mind control devices to justify warfare.
Is this part of the human race kind of history? Is the only people that actually want to justify warfare are the ones who are freaking psychopathic killers who want to get something out of it? Nobody actually else, like ordinary, decent people. They just want to kind of stay home, raise their families. And it's always the people that own everything and think that they own you that want to send everybody to war to die.
Oh, God, that's just so true. And that attitude, the attitude of the elite that wants to control the mass because they want complete control over the money and on the land, and they want this kind of oligarchic power, that's what has produced our religious literature. You see the problem? It always has been the case that it comes from the sociopaths. And therefore, it is just like a lump of bad thinking that infests every single individual that comes in contact with it. And when Ryan and I were first talking about this, Ryan explained a lot of research that he has done to me that shows how the sociopath connects to the Bible, to the entire Bible. I was wondering if you'd actually comment on that, Ryan.
Well, the way I see it, it's the Old Testament is a very political document. Just like in Joe's work, he's showing that the New Testament came out of a time of war, even though it's full of these nice pastoral scenes of shepherds and people going across the countryside. But this was a time of violent war, and we have a case that looks like an early example of controlled opposition. So as always, a controlled opposition has to look attractive to anyone rebelling against the current power structure. And so the Romans looks like they went through incredible lengths to pacify this messianic movement. And again, the Messiah, what we think of today as Messiah, we associate it with Jesus Christ, in most of Western culture, and not knowing that the Romans reversed the meaning of that word. To the Jews of the first century, a Messiah is a warrior king who defeats his enemies through the power of God. And this idea inspired a lot of rebellious Jews, and by some estimates, they were 10 to 15% of the Roman Empire. So to the Romans, this was a huge threat to their power. And maybe you can explain, Joe, there was perhaps maybe 4 attempts to take over Judaism.
Right. It's sort of interesting. People look at Christianity as like this novel thing that just sort of emerged in the first century, but actually it was at least the 3rd attempt to restructure the Jewish religion into a form that it could abide with inside the Roman Empire. The first effort was by the family of Herod, and the Herods are famous. They're in the New Testament. They're described quite often, and they were Rome's tax collector of Judea. And the family was originally Greek and Gentile, but they saw that there was problems ruling the Jewish population because the Jews did not like their ethnicity and religion. So they converted to Judaism, but that didn't work either. And so what they did was to take Maccabean brides. Now, the Maccabees were the family that had set up the Jewish state in the 2nd century BC, and the one that had been deposed by the Roman Empire. And so when they took Maccabean brides, they were essentially trying to breed a Christ. In other words, they would, because the Jewish people looked through the maternal lineage, they would look to these people who had been born of Maccabean brides and Herod fathers. They would look at them as legitimate kings of Judea. But this just didn't work. And the rebellions broke out and just kept on coming. And so another family, just by amazing circumstance, which had to be Rome's tax collector in Egypt, family is called the Alexanders, then they began to produce a literature which was written by this guy named Philo Alexander, who wrote a kind of watered down Judaism. In other words, he took out the violent messianic parts of the literature and put in place these Hellenized pro-multiculturalism and rationalism philosophies. And so Philo is seen as having blended Hellenism with Judaism. And this literature was then circulated, but again, it just didn't work. The rebellions against Rome broke out essentially in the year 1. In other words, the very first year that, according to the Bible's chronology, that Jesus was in existence, that was when a guy named Judas the Galilean created a rebellion in Galilee, which of course is where Jesus is supposedly from. And they began fighting against the Roman Empire. And these rebellions never really stopped. The rebellions continued throughout the first century and then ended up with an enormous nationwide rebellion that broke out in 66. It was led by a Messianic movement. This was the national Messianic movement. So no matter what the New Testament claims in terms of a Christian Messianic organization, the national movement was militaristic. It was led by a Christ who would have been a warrior. They drove Rome out. They set up a nation state, and the rebellion finally came under control with the famous mass suicide at Masada in 73. But this wasn't the end of it. The Messianic movement broke out another rebellion in 115. They essentially drove Rome completely out of the breadbasket of Egypt. They slaughtered all of the Gentiles in the islands of Crete and Rhodes. I believe that Tacitus put the number at over 250,000, right? So this movement was very serious and very powerful and was genocidal against the Gentiles. Rome eventually put this rebellion down, but it just broke out again, 133. Again, this was in Judea. The rebellion took control of the nation. They again set up a nation state, were minting their own coins, had their own government. And this led to the Bar Kokhba battle, which was the most violent battle that Rome ever had. They lost so many Roman troops in the struggle that it was the only time in the history of the Roman Empire that the salutation of a returning general wasn't given. And that salutation was that we hope Caesar is well, and if Caesar is well, the troops and the general is well. And this would be something the general would say to Caesar when he came up. And they didn't give it because they were afraid that if they made the statement the troops are well, there was so many citizens that had lost sons in the war that there would be a civilian rebellion of the Roman population against the Caesars. So that's how brutal these wars were.
So they were very motivated, and because fighting them on the battlefield wasn't completely working, they had to get into the Jews' minds.
Right. And so that's what happened. That's why that was the motivation to try to create a version of the Messianic Judaism that was the Messiah would just say, turn the other cheek and give to Caesar what is Caesar's. It was really that simple.
Can I ask as well? Actually, we're coming to break. I'll save my question for after that one. When we talk about religion, when we talk about the past, people don't realize is that history is written by the victors, and so are its religious texts, aren't they?
Right.
You know?
Agreed.
It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? He who controls the past controls the present and winds up controlling the future.
I want to go into that for a second. Yeah.
All right. Back in a minute, ladies and gentlemen. Don't you go anywhere. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinnie Eastwood Show. My very special guests are author of Caesar's Messiah, Joe Atwill, and his accomplice and surrogate. I think surrogate's not the right word. Ryan Gilmore, anyway. And we want to talk about the historical context. Those who control it. Those who rewrite history for their own ends so that they can manipulate people into being slaves. Joe, go for your life.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, Jesus makes all these predictions about what will occur. He says the Galilean towns are going to be crushed. He says that Jerusalem's going to be encircled with a wall, and he says the temple's going to be razed, and that the abomination of desolation that Daniel predicted is going to actually come to pass. And he says, this is all going to take place before the generation I'm talking to passes away. So in other words, 40 years, that's the length of time for a generation in this era. And you see, when you talk about the victors writing history, what Jesus is predicting are all military victories. He even gives the exact date that these military victories will occur. his ministry is between 30 and 33, and the war that he's talking about is between 70 and 73. So you have to ask yourself, well, who actually wrote this literature? Typically, when you've got military victories, it's the victors that write it. That's just the straightforward, ordinary way of understanding our history. The defeated didn't get a chance to write it because they were defeated and they vanished typically. So when you look at the Christian story, the story of Jesus, the first thing that someone should be suspicious about is that it's all about war victories. And when you then look at, well, who had the motivation, the opportunity, capacity, it turns out that the victors of these war battles were the individuals that had these attributes, that they did have the motivation, they did have the opportunity, and they did have the capacity to produce the literature. So rather than seeing the Jesus story as, coming from the Romans as being something that's far-fetched, the fact is that any honest forensic analysis of it, looking at it like you would a literature that had just come out of, from unknown provenance, the first thing that would pop to your mind, the most obvious explanation is that, well, this was written by the victors, that all of the individual that won all these battles, that they produced this prophet, and he predicted their victories.
The story we're told is that Christianity, or the Roman Empire was against Christianity, and they persecuted Christians. And but eventually, the royal family in Rome became Christians themselves and became state religion of the empire. So it's, if you know the real history of the era, which isn't represented in the New Testament, you have a contradiction, because it was a time of great struggle between Rome and the Jews. And knowing that, it's a contradiction that the imperial family in Rome would start to take up the religion of their enemies, a version of Judaism. And especially with the family tree that Joe points out in Caesar's Messiah, is that the first pope that appears in history was Caesar Vespasian's great-great-nephew. One of the first Christian martyrs, Clemens, was Vespasian's great-nephew. The first Christian catacomb that we have actual inscriptions of, which is created by Flavia Domitilla, that's Vespasian's granddaughter. So we have a very tight circle of family members becoming the first Christians. And so if Rome was at war with the Jews at the time, it's very strange, if that's true, that all these members of the royal family would convert to Christianity.
Yeah, it is very odd, isn't it? In fact, it's just preposterous.
Joe, you kind of breaking up just a little bit there, but there was a point that I wanted to make. There's been a lot of people claiming that many hundreds, even thousands of passages in the Bible that have been claiming to predict the future have in fact come true. I was just wondering whether or not those bits were added in after the fact to give it credibility.
Well, certainly all of the prophecies of Jesus were simply written after the war. And in fact, scholars are in complete agreement, or virtually complete agreement, that the Gospels were written following the Roman war, for the simple reason that the events of the Roman war are found inside the Gospels. And since people cannot see in the future, there is simply no other explanation for the literature except that it was written after the war. So this is just a common technique, as you pointed out, of other authors wanting to seem important or connected to God, And it's the most natural and commonsensical way to simply understand the Gospels.
Yeah, I don't think we should automatically dismiss precognition when you're looking at these things. It's just you could set that aside and say, well, let's look for evidence, the down-to-earth evidence first. You know, if we can't find any evidence that that the book was simply written after the events that they pertain to prophesize, let's check if there's evidence for that first. And if there isn't, well, maybe then we can start investigating.
Yeah, I mean, what I would do is say, look, if this is actually somehow divinely connected, then it should be just a no-brainer for the Pope to be able to come and to help me with the racing form tomorrow. He should be able to pick every single winner. The fact is, he can't pick any. He can't help my gambling addiction at all because he can't see into the future. So,
and actually, Joe shows that the Romans examined the Jewish literature. They actually destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, stole the Torah, locked it away in the palace, and studied it. This is in Josephus, and they looked at the literature of so many Jewish scholars trying to predict the future with the patterns in the Hebrew Bible. And we think they thought this was funny and ridiculous and contrary to reason.
Mm. Yeah, they didn't believe you could see into the future. And they thought that the Messianic Jews' belief in prophecy was absurd, and in fact that the whole idea of these prophets that are essentially the primary writers of the Hebrew Bible, which is these prophets talking about things that will occur in the future, that this was absurd. And so the character Jesus Christ is created by the Romans as an improvement over what they see as these absurd Jewish prophets, in that everything that Jesus predicts comes true. Now, of course, to create a true prophet, you have to write one that's writing about things that have already happened. So that's, you can kind of start to structure how the character is developed just step by step by Rome. He's just a version of the prophets that they saw inspiring the Jews to rebel. And he's an improvement. Jesus gets every single one of his prophecies right. What was going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls are prophecies that show the Jews would be defeating the Roman Empire. That's how they were interpreting it. And so Rome just said, well, this literature is not in our interests, and so we need to replace it. And so the Gospels were produced, and it just shows that all of these prophecies that the Jews thought were going to give them a ruler that would defeat the Romans actually can be seen to have predicted the Romans themselves as the divine ruler that the Jews are supposed to worship. I mean, really, if you just look at it from a distance, Christianity is just another version of the imperial cult. The Caesars were always adopting the gods of the regions they conquered and taking on the identities of Vespasian, who was a Caesar that was the father of Titus, the individual who produced the Gospels. Vespasian, when he came to Alexandria, he goes into a temple of Artemis, I believe, and he comes out as the new Artemis. He comes out being able to work miracles, being able to see into the future. I mean, he just becomes this local god. So the reason that the Romans, kind of tweaked this character, was just this was just a tradition that they always had, and it was just one of the mind control devices that Rome used to rule the provinces.
What's interesting is when you're talking about this, about how the rulers would come in, embody certain gods, adopt local customs and beliefs and so on and so forth in order to rule over them, it reminds me exactly of what Alexander the Great did. That's precisely what he did. He went to the oracles around Alexandria, and they said, "Oh, you're going to this great person." He comes out claiming to be all this stuff that they all prophesize and what have you. And lo and behold, they name Alexandria after him, build this big ass frickin' library, which the Romans took all the important books out of and burned the rest, so that nobody would know their real history or the truth about what BS that they were shilling people in order to control them. We'll be right back after the break. It's now hour number 2 of the fastest 2 hours in talk radio. It's the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live from Auckland, New Zealand, the island-chained nation in the Fukushima-irradiated sunny slave South Pacific, where everyone got a part-time job as an energy-saver light bulb and also worships Masonic idols. And me and Joe were talking over the break about the Freemasonry in New Zealand. So we've got the Prime Sinister John Key, 32nd degree Freemason. You go to freemasons.org.nz, the official Freemasons website of New Zealand, and guess who's on the front frickin' page? You guessed it, the Prime Sinister John frickin' Key. And then you think about this. Ooh, Auckland, the city of the future. Over 1 million people living in the city, largest city in the country by far. Like more than twice the size of any other comparable city, growing hugely. This is where all the immigrants and everything come in, because it's really the only decent place to live in the country that doesn't have incredibly crap weather. It's freezing as hell, because it's kind of subtropical. It's quite nice. And the other element is, who was running for mayor of this big, massive Auckland region that they forced in on everybody and didn't give them a freaking choice and rejected any attempt at a referendum? It was 33rd degree Freemason John Banks was one of the mayoral candidates, going up against 32nd degree Freemason Len Brown, who was the other mayoral candidate, who is now the mayor of Auckland, and John Banks is the main coalition partner to 32nd degree Freemason John Key in Parliament, which is a beehive, which was designed by a Freemason, commissioned by a Freemason Prime Minister at the time, and is now the black and white Masonic tiled floored place where all of the reporters report live from Parliament. Thank you very much. There's no such thing as a Masonic conspiracy, and there's no control. There's nothing like going on. It's just an old friendly organisation full of a bunch of old boys who ain't got really nothing better to do but to get the frack away from their wives. And I was saying about maybe 80 or 80+% of Freemasons. That's probably the case. You know, they're not involved in no conspiracy or anything like that. But for those who get really, really high up, just remember, there's only 99 33rd degree Freemasons in the world. 33 in America, 33 in Europe, and 33 in the Southern Hemisphere. So, I don't think that if you're going to employ a conspiracy, you'd really involve more than a couple of hundred people in it, really. And if you did, it'd have to be, of course, by invitation only, and you'd have to sell your soul to join in some way. Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore are my very special guests, guys. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Well, glad to be back.
Joe, continuing on here, because we talked about how the similarities between the Roman Empire and Alexander the Great were pretty synonymous. So they come in, they embody the local traditions and so on and so forth, so that they can propagandize and basically control all of them without too much resistance. I mean, take a look at Christian holidays. They're based on pagan ritual holidays as well, aren't they? You know, solstices and equinoxes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, they would try to essentially use the prior religion as a basis. They would make the ideological adjustments that were necessary in order to get their form of control in place, but they want it to be as transparent and as similar as possible to the prior religions. And if they could, they would hire the old priests to get them to promote the Romanized version, because these were obviously just techniques that were used to keep the population subdued. And in back of all of this, you have the secret society. You see, this is the problem. And I was kind of interested in the thoughts you were having at the beginning of this hour. You know, within the Vatican, you have a kind of secret society, the cardinals, this college that does the election of the Pope and elects more cardinals, and the number is controlled. And what goes on inside their discussions is completely secret. Well, that ruled the world for over 1,000 years, that very organization. That during the feudal system was where power actually resided. Now we have these other secret organizations that have seemingly a tremendous amount of political power, and one really should learn the lesson of Christianity, which is that there should be no secret societies. And if someone belongs to one and has allegiance to one, then they should never, ever, under any circumstances, be permitted to have any political power in the democratic sense. Because without knowing what the real ideology is, without complete sunshine in the secret organization, how can you really ever know what you're getting, where the allegiance of the individual really lies? And so when I look at New Zealand, I was there a couple of years ago and spent some time there. My wife had actually lived in New Zealand for a long period. I was amazed at how all of these Masonic buildings and images are just everywhere. And I thought, wow, you see, there really isn't any democracy in New Zealand, because without knowing what goes on inside these high levels, you don't really know what you're getting. Here we have...
Well, I think Forrest Gump had a philosophy on this. My Freemasonic political appointees are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Yeah, that's the thing. And see, that's why you can, if you want to belong to these organizations, fine, but then don't run for a political office. Or if you do, you have to permit complete disclosure. You have to have people who are able to come into any level of the organization and gain whatever information is going on and bring it back and report. Otherwise, we have no democracy.
Well, the Queen actually retains that right. In fact, she commands, allegedly, state intelligence services in New Zealand, the SIS, to check out every single politician in the game. We found out that Green Party and social libertarian Keith Locke was surveilled since the age of 10 because he went and saw what was assumed to be at the time a communist movie with his mum.
Right. Well, then that just shows you that you have some work to do there in New Zealand as far as creating a democratic state. We, of course, in the United States have exactly the same problem, and I mean literally the same problem. So we need to give praise to shows like yours and to you for having the courage to bring the information to the public that, something, you're slaves. Sorry, but you don't have any control over what seems to be these democratic institutions. You need to do some hard work of citizenry. You need to start producing candidates that you really can be sure are not aligned with the Queen, with the Freemasons, or with other organizations that have these hidden agendas. Because when you do, you end up with things like the Syrian mess, where the citizenry of the United States is opposed by 91% to 9, right? That we are opposed over 90% to this war activity, and yet it looks for almost certain it's going to occur.
And don't you find it interesting that the day that the people come together and vote on this, I think it might have been the Senate Select Committee or whatever, they all come together and they vote on this on 9/11 to give that extra oomph?
Yeah, it is quite strange, isn't it? It just, again, when you have secret societies that have tremendous amounts of political power, you just don't know what you're going to get. Democracy isn't a transparent process. It's a Cracker Jack box with a prize in it. And the prize can be, population reduction. This is just the hard work that we have to do. We have to start creating better candidates. And the one thing we have to do is to create a better media, a media that really vets these people. Someone like Keyes should have been vetted as just unacceptable material for democracy long time ago. He should never have possibly have been a candidate because of his relationships with Freemasonry.
And Wall Street, his Wall Street connections are up to wazoo.
Yeah,
he
exactly.
worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York for 2 years as the head of European bond and derivatives trade.
Absolutely.
Which Money Magazine said that derivatives were one of the main primary causes of the 2008 financial crisis, which he helped cause. And incidentally, he comes in to become Prime Minister of the country in 2008 to manage a crisis that he in part helped cause.
Right. Well, the idea that when you have a crisis which is caused by fraud inside the banking system, that will be solved by someone who is involved with fraud inside the banking system. This is sort of like that when a country has too much debt, the way to fix the problem is to create more debt. It's just the big lie, which you would think just on a commonsensical surface level would never be vetted by the media. The media would be exposing this right and left, saying this is ridiculous. We can't have someone like this in the high office. And yet, because the media has been compromised, the citizens don't get the information. They go through the election. They end up with keys. And then, believe me, the financial crisis is going to occur again very shortly in New Zealand. And the citizens are going to be scratching their head wondering, well, what the heck happened? We thought it was fixed. It isn't fixed because the media gave you someone that was essentially incapable and did not want to fix it. So we need a new media. If you don't have control over the media, you don't have control over your mind. The ideas that circulate are destructive, created by the oligarchs. They are there to keep you from thinking clearly. And this is why learning about Christianity is such a great lesson. Because, you see, it was obviously the mind control device of the feudal system, and it was the only media that was possible. The Romans controlled all of the roads. They controlled all of the literature. Like you mentioned, they burned all the libraries. And all that was left was the New Testament. That was what they wanted you to believe in. And because of that, there was never a successful rebellion. I mean, it's just inconceivable that the slaves sat there generation after generation, just taking it and never rebel. No recorded rebellions that the serf brought against the oligarchs. And then, of course, you end up with, modern day serfdom, whereby, you have a situation in World War I where people who are essentially racial brothers who have no idea whatsoever has brought this war into existence are walking into automatic weapon fire. Now, there was a few instances of rebellion. A few soldiers tried to fight back and would shoot the sergeants that would give the orders, but not enough to prevent this wholesale slaughter of, and I mean, we're talking tens of millions here, brother. It was just unbelievable.
And they were the best and brightest and the strongest and the smartest.
They were the object of the operation. The idea was to run them into one another and slaughter them so the oligarchs could have the population configuration they wanted. And so this is, this is the hard work of citizenry that has to occur. We need to start developing citizens that won't be used as cannon fodder, that you can't just say, well, blow up that individual and incidentally, if you die, we'll give you a fancy funeral with a few flags. The individual has to develop and become the resistance, the innate resistance to the oligarchs, because they will always attempt to use tyranny, and they will attempt to use you for your destruction, because that's what power means. That's what it is. That's what their purpose for it has always been.
That's why ordinary people
develop the individuals whose thinking is the way that they can resist the oligarch. They automatically resist the oligarchs just by their very the way that they look at the world, the way they process information.
Do you think? Do you think that people don't actually want power, really? I mean, I've noticed that what really separates, say, somebody like me versus somebody like John Key is that he seems to be accomplishing an agenda to try and have power over other people, whereas me, I've got an agenda to only have power over myself and to give power to others.
If a lot of leaders are psychopathic, and we can't say all of them are, but some of them are. I see psychopaths as a kind of consciousness vampire that they
a parasite.
It's a parasite. But a consciousness one. Yeah, and if they don't have people beneath them to sort of feed off of. It's almost like a predator that's what they need to survive. So I almost think that they are driven to those positions of power out of some kind of instinct. And,
it's been well documented that there is a psychopathic mentality that is very well placed within corporations, within governments. And what we've done on this show is, I think we had a week where we had almost an entire week on psychopaths, both the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual elementals of the equation. And what it appeared to be, at least consensus across all three of these fields, is that it is a mind parasite. It is capable of infecting and taking over people. And that to me was actually the scariest thing. And they also concluded that these creatures can't survive without an entourage, without an audience, without energy to be to suck off of other people. You stick them on an island, even though there's heaps of food and everything like that, or in water. If they got nobody to leech off of, if they got no more mind energy to suck, they die.
Yeah, to use religious language, it's like regular people have souls and they don't, so they need to feed off ours. I mean, that's I think, the metaphysical explanation that kind of satisfies me, because, we don't have a scientific language to understand this. And I think just to criticize science now, we've been criticizing religion, but to criticize science...
by that, I take it you mean that science isn't a religion?
Well, I mean to say that in mainstream science, apart from some psychologists who've been studying this, they don't really believe this is real. They don't, or at least the research is suppressed a bit by psychopaths in power who don't want too much information about this getting out. It's sort of this is sort of the, I think, positive side to the myths and religious stories that we had about things like vampires and demons, that they were, pre-scientific explanations for psychopaths.
Yeah. And we're coming to break now. Okay, so we'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. You know, it's interesting how all the conversations that I seem to have on the show somehow revolve around psychopathy. I don't know, maybe it's newsworthy. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinnie Eastwood Show, the show from which you cannot hide. It's on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 5 days a week. Archives at theVinnieEastwoodShow.com. That's Vinnie with a Y, because it's the most important question. And Eastwood doesn't go ahead. Make my news. And it's completely listener-supported as well. So if you want to go to the homepage of theVinnieEastwoodShow.com, make a donation through the bank account, which is available there. Automatic payments are really, really highly valued, because that regular income and support is the reason why I'm able to continue, after more than 3 years, to give hours upon hours of airtime to activists, authors, researchers, doctors, politicians, filmmakers, radio hosts, and ordinary people just like you. Because the media frickin' won't, and the corporations that currently put all their advertising and everything all over the media have no interest in funding a show like this. The people, on the other hand, really have an awful lot of interest in shows like this. So please, open your hearts, open your wallets, and support the Vinnie Eastwood Show. in all its magnificent glory and fun and friendliness. Because if you listen 5 days a week, you'll hear 5 completely different views, but 5 completely different topics, generally, in any given week. And you'll have a geometrically increased possibility of having something that changes your life happen to you. I can assure you of this. I have received many emails hearing this much different opinion and this wide diversity of topics from such a array of talented, interesting, and educated people is enough to blow anybody's mind. Even if you happen to be one of those talented and interesting people, like Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore. Welcome back. You were having a conversation without me over the break, and you said you wanted to continue it. What was it?
Joe mentioned alternative media and how alternative media has started with shows like yours, and that's amazing, and I think our savior in these critical times. Another piece of the puzzle, I think, is alternative education. And maybe we can use the internet for this. I don't know. But that'd be something I'd like to see, because one thing is we don't have information, and we're starting to get that information out through those channels. But we've also lost our clear reasoning skills because they've been taken out of education, so that we learn a lot of false history and just a plethora of facts, but we aren't taught in school generally how to sift through those facts. How do you evaluate them as true or false? And the truth movement is slowly gaining back those skills just by practicing with all this extra information now we now have access to. We can start to evaluate things, and we go down these rabbit holes and we find out, oh no, I thought that was true at first, but now I'm starting to be skeptical of that theory and try out another theory and feel embarrassed, and that's part of the process. But
we're starting to reverse this this downward trend in IQs, aren't we? And speaking of which,
yes.
Something we keep forgetting, covertmessiah.com, ladies and gentlemen. covertmessiah.com. That's where you can get more information on Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore. I just had to squeeze that in there because I know we've been reminding ourselves to say it and haven't said it yet.
Thanks, Vinny. So please go there to our event to find more information about the event on the 19th of October 2013, and you can buy tickets there as well. And if you're in London, come and meet Joe Atwill. Also, there will be Kenneth Humphreys. He's the author of Jesus Never Existed. He'll be speaking there as well. And we'll be showing the great documentary by Fritz Heed on Joe's book, Caesar's Messiah.
Mm. Now, anyway, we were talking about this particular problem and how alternative media and the internet are going to be able to facilitate the re-education, to use a Communist Manifesto term.
Yeah. So it's not just information. It's not just information, but we have to get really good at evaluating that information because, of course, as most people who've learned being in the truth movement, that there is a lot of false information, and you have to have a way of starting to sift through that.
Okay. Here's my favorite example of false information. Yeah. December 21st, 2012. Enough said.
Thank God we're past that date.
God.
Thank goodness.
But
I wonder if Joe, you could get into some of the source of that apocalypse.
Sure. And that's a really good example of what Ryan is mentioning, is that people simply couldn't deal with that absurdity because they didn't really have the right sort of training. In the Middle Ages, there was a particular pedagogy that they used with the children of the wealthier classes, the trivium and the quadrivium, they were called. And they basically are just the study of logic and grammar and the relationship between the two. And those individuals, the people who had power, knew that this was the right way to approach phenomena in the world. And this is why it isn't taught in our public schools, and why people as adults just are lost typically, and in conversation, because they just don't automatically have the training in grammar and logic that would, make a lot of the information that comes out of the mainstream media revealed as incorrect just automatically. But, getting back to the magic date, I mean, that comes from Terence McKenna, who was one of the LSD I think some other very powerful drug, DMT or something like that, DDT, I don't know.
DDT, that's a pesticide.
But, he of course was promoting these heroic doses of these psychedelic drugs, enough literally to produce psychosis, when it was determined later on that he wasn't taking them at all. But
really? Terence McKenna wasn't taking the acid trips that he was...
Of course not. His brother admitted that no, he hadn't taken any drugs in 20 years. In fact, he mainly just drank booze. But you see, this should be this really shouldn't surprise anyone, because the entire psychedelic movement was vetted. It comes out of the CIA project MK Ultra. Robert Hunter, who was the lyricist of the Grateful Dead, and Ken Kesey, who was the guy of the psychedelic bus, they are both known as employees of the organization. And then since with the Freedom of Information Act, now the original story, the one that supposedly propelled these individuals into starting to be interested in psychedelic drugs, which occurred in Life magazine in 1957, was about this guy, Gordon Wasson, who was supposedly interested in psychedelic drugs. Now, it just so happened he was also the director of public relations and a vice president at J.P. Morgan Bank, and was also the head of the Council of Foreign Relations, right? So a little suspicious. But then, as it turns out, with the Freedom of Information Act, you can find out that Wasson's entire development of the psychedelic mushrooms in Mexico was this MK Ultra project. And this isn't open for contention. I mean, the letter exists showing that Wasson arranged for funding for all of the trips to Mexico through the CIA and MK Ultra. And so you have to say, well, what are they doing? Why is all of this psychedelia, such an important thing? Well, it turns out that they really wanted to start developing the neo-feudalism probably right after World War II. Gregory Bateson, who was Margaret Mead's husband, again, using the Freedom of Information Act, letters have been found. They're published in a well-known book called Weaponizing Anthropology by Dr. David Price, showing that Bateson actually, though he claimed to be a proponent of psychedelic drugs and a big humanist, right? He's always telling people peace and love, speaker at the Esalen Institute. Now, in his real life, he was instructing the government of the United States and Britain in how to operate a more effective slave colony. And in the letters that Price has found, it shows Bateson describing experiments of the Russian government on their Asiatic populations to determine how they can best be kept in a slave state. And he says that the experiment that showed the best of a inferior population, he uses that expression, that exact term, being controlled by a superior population, he used the exact term, was that you had to develop a native revival or an archaic revival. In other words, you don't want the inferior people being jealous of the technology that the rulers had. Rather, you wanted them to embrace their past, right? So this was why you have Bateson being at the very first meetings where MK Ultra is established, evidently explaining to them how to do it. You then go on until you have all of these rock and roll people who just come out of nowhere that give away LSD for free. And in the midst of all this, you have this philosophy about peace, love, returning to the commune, and living off the land and kind of abandoning technology, right? Dennis McKenna comes along, and he calls it the archaic revival. You see, uses the exact expression that Bateson had talked about when he was saying that this is how you could essentially develop the more effective slave state. Basically, science, in this case anthropology, has been used to improve the feudal system. And all of these individuals that the media pops out can be traced to the organization, or at least a great many of them. For just as a casual example, Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, his father was Admiral Morrison, who was the person in charge of the false flag event at the Gulf of Tonkin. You see? And you just go on and on. David Crosby, same things, father OSS member, Annapolis graduate. Frank Zappa. I mean, there's a guy named David McGowan, I believe his name is. He looked into the backgrounds of the rock stars and just was amazed. He couldn't understand why it was the case, but he was just amazed that so many of them came out of military intelligence. And so then you have the same phenomena occurring up in San Francisco, where you have all of these people, the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey, and LSD being given away en masse. And I mean en masse. I mean, the Grateful Dead would have hundreds of thousands of tabs that they somehow miraculously had, and they just gave it away to everyone for free. So what's going on here? Well, it's the archaic revival, brother. You're looking at your government in action, and they're trying to dumb down the population, to drop you out of technology, put you into a kind of neo-feudalism. Now, in the neo-feudalism...
Can I say, I was just thinking about this.
Hold on, but just one last point, and then we'll go for it. Now, you need Christianity, right, to make it all just perfect. So you have a thing called A Course in Miracles, which was two psychiatrists, psychologists, Thetford and Schumann, claiming that they were able to channel Jesus Christ. And he developed all of these bizarre ideas that led you away from being able to criticize the government or anything, right? And simply learn to be at peace with the world as it is. Now, oddly enough, if you look into their backgrounds, these two individuals are part of what project? MK Ultra. They are both, at the very moment that they are developing the Course in Miracle, are being paid, their salaries being paid for by the CIA. So now when you look at it as a pattern, you just have a really lovely package of neo-feudalism, and you've even got neo-Christianity on top to make everybody happy about it.
And this came out of Joe's study of Christianity. I think this it became a case study where he saw a controlled opposition. I mean, back in the first century, Christianity seemed like something for rebellious youth and something against the empire. And going from the 50s to the 60s, the psychedelic culture seemed like, oh, well, that's a way to sort of rebel against Christianity. But the sad fact is, or at least this is the way it looks, is it's another thing from the same playbook, another controlled opposition.
It's another controlled opposition.
Yeah.
Well, and all of those individuals that were taken into that rat hole of the counterculture, and I was there.
Can I say something?
Years to recover from. Years to recover.
It's because no proper
the drugs,
movement.
The absurd abandonment of technology, the absurd abandonment of careers and trajectories that might have given them some real political power, some ability to defend themselves. That all disappeared. And at the same time, you've got these weird concepts like feminism comes into play, right? You start breaking up the family. The family starts disappearing. This is all part of neo-feudalism. This is exactly what happened with Constantine. The family was destroyed.
Oh, well, that's pretty loud music right there, just cutting us off. Okay, well, Joe, we'll be back. We'll be back right after the break. And I was thinking, some movement should actually be called for to expose the serfdom. You know how the birth certificate movement was called the birthers. We could have somebody to expose the serfdom and call them the surfer movement. I don't know. We'll be right back. We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. Don't you go anywhere. You're listening to the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 5 days a week. The time zones are going to be changing soon as well, and that'll be nice. So in New Zealand, the new time will be starting next month, 11 a.m. till 1 p.m. local time. And then on, I think, November the 4th, there's another time zone change for the US, and so it becomes midday till 2 p.m. For the summertime schedule of the Vinnie Eastwood Show. So, Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore are my guests, and where exactly would we like to wrap up? Because we've talked about MK Ultra, we've talked about mind control, we've talked about Rome, Alexander the Great, and the Freemasons, and so on and so forth. And
I want to apologize for offending both Christians and members of the psychedelic movement, because I think we've offended both of them. But
well, I've said for a long time, Ryan, that if you say the truth, you offend both sides of every major argument, because the reason why those major arguments have been going on for the best part of 100 years and nobody's won is because they're both full of BS.
Yeah, we think the truth is will eventually set us free, and it's the best way to go. And it's painful to find out some of the things you believed in might have been part of a government program. But we need to find out. We need to find out these things. We need to be able to practice and to recognize them.
Now, there's good parts in the Bible and the psychedelic movement, little grains of truth amid a beach of lies.
Yeah, I mean, if Ken Kesey had painted his bus with, symbols of people being, enchained in dungeons, he probably couldn't got the kids to take the LSD. So they always wrap it in a nice package. And you've got, with Jesus, you've got all these little, kind of beneficial statements about love and peace, etc. But, inside all of that is the political context, and that's the more powerful message. And it's also the need to just recognize what the effect was historically, because that usually will tell you what was the real purpose for it. Particularly things that last a long time and are very effective in particularly within the media. There was the purpose of debasing the intellect of the baby boom generation, and that was accomplished through the counterculture and the psychedelic movement. And Rome did have in mind to make the serf defenseless against the priest and bishop who came demanding their children and food. And so when you just view this stuff as, in terms of what actually was produced by it, you get, I think, the true origins of it are much more clear. And so we want to, in London, at the venue, which is coming on up October 19th, we want to expose and also to illuminate and hopefully to give people some methods of defending themselves. Because if we were just dealing with history, it wouldn't be so urgent. But the fact is, we're dealing with the minds that we have been given and are affecting us right now, and with the events that are threatening all of our livelihoods and safety right now. So it's a good time to try to find the truth of Christianity and to develop some suspicions about government mind control.
I see it as no accident that we have a conflict in the Middle East, and we have conflicts in the Middle East from 2,500 years ago in the Bible. They're definitely connected. And the more we learn the real history of that period, which was kind of frozen in time, the hatred from those periods has been frozen in time. And I hope at the conference we'll talk more about that and see how it connects to today.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that the religious literature has been developed from these wars, and it has frozen the hatred in place. And the hatred still exists because of this religious literature. And by exposing its real origins, hopefully this will help people recover from it.
And I think why the Jews of the time, the radical Jews that were rebelling against Rome, one reason they weren't compatible because they believed in things that we'd call today one world government, one set of international laws, destroy all their other religions, so they would be the only religion, and a one world ruler that they called the Messiah. And they wanted that world government to be centered in Jerusalem. So that's what Rome was up against.
Now, what are we up against? Because what's happening, I've found, whenever I'm looking at history, is it's more or less the same story as what we've got now, just a different face, a different name, and a different region being told. But
like you were talking about psychopaths infecting us, that's what we need, the antidote. we need the antivirus to that. And that's what we hopefully can do in the Truth Movement, is come up with that antivirus, because psychopaths are at most 4 or 5% of the population. It could be 1%. It's hard to tell. But as you were saying earlier, there's a lot more of us, and they need us to carry out the wars. If soldiers aren't infected with the psychopathy, they won't do the dirty work of wars.
That's true.
Couldn't be trained as drones. It's, listening to Ryan's words, I just find them really touching, and it brings to mind the videos of the ones that came out in WikiLeaks, where they had a guy in a helicopter being instructed by some guy on a video screen in Arizona to execute civilians who were just walking down the street somewhere in Iraq or Afghanistan. And when I saw that, I just thought, the mind of the helicopter operator and the gunner were literally like pieces of the computer. They had just lost all connection to humanity. There just wasn't any human left. They were drones. And so that's where the sociopath has won, and the population has essentially become part of his sickness. So we will fix all of this, I promise you, and more on October 19th. Well, maybe that's ambitious, but we'll at least do our best to try to give the citizens something to defend themselves with, because when, it's fine when you're sitting in the helicopter firing at people, but remember, ultimately you end up just like the civilians who ended up in the trenches in World War I, where you get to walk into the automatic weapon fire because you're now the population the oligarchs want to reduce. So that is the level of energy that we need to bring to our attempts to form a defensible citizenry. We have to realize that it's life and death, and that we are about to walk into the automatic weapon fire. The oligarchs in the old days could look out at the fields and see their serfs doing useful productivity. Now, all they can see is, the welfare state, individuals, not producing anything for them. And believe me, this is a dangerous situation, because they're not going to accept that. They're going to find a way to get the population down to the number they want, and that's a big reduction. So we have to start promoting the ideas that can defend themselves, help us defend against that.
Indeed. The surfer movement. That seems to be the right time. I could just think about, like the serfs storming the royals or something like that. Prince Charles and Camilla stuck in some kind of London cab with gold awnings or whatever, freaking out, cuddling each other in fear. Ooh, the slaves are revolting.
Yeah.
I could just dream for the day. I also dream for the day when the phones were dumb and the people were smart. And unfortunately, you can't turn back the clock sometimes, can you?
Move forward.
Yeah.
We can only do the best we can, but we can do so with urgency and with the genius that desperation creates. Invention will have necessity as its mother, and it's time to get cracking and to start developing some better political representatives.
Yeah, and in order to do that, we need accurate political reporting.
Yeah, and training people how to think and showing them what the history has been so they can see how desperate the situation is. So all of these things are necessary. And Vinny, once again, you're to be commended. Doing a great job there, brother. So keep it up. And, let's establish a beachhead of freedom in New Zealand.
Yeah. We have lots of beaches in New Zealand, but not a whole lot of head. Thank you, Joe, for coming.
Thank you, buddy.
That was not a sexual reference, by the way, you dirty listeners. And thank you, Joe, for coming on. Ryan, thank you too. And
thanks, man.
Joe, I know that you have to go, so thank you very much.
I gotta go on. See you guys. Talk to you tomorrow.
All right. And there's the music. And away we go. Ryan Gilmore as well. The website's covertmessiah.com. That's covertmessiah.com. And one more time, just for good measure, covertmessiah.com, ladies and gentlemen. Go and check it out. You'll be surprised how much history you can get if you've got some of the, the kind of stuff that the people who wrote the history books kind of don't want you to know about. There's a whole big world out there. There was a whole big world long ago, and there's an even bigger one coming if only you would realize what is truly going on now and what really happened in the past. And then we can have a thought and a pattern come congruent so that freedom itself may be preserved for future generations. Please go to thevinnieeastwoodshow.com for the archives and donate if you support this broadcast. We'll see you again sometime, folks.
No matter where you live, globalism affects you. Did you know that the Vinnie Eastwood Show has more subscribers than New Zealand Herald TV and is New Zealand's most popular YouTube news channel, where warm-hearted humour and a list of awesome guests talk about crucial issues which the mainstream media ignore? A show where you, the listener, can phone up with questions, comments and suggestions of guests. Vinnie is building a hub to connect truthers with raw information they need to become active. He can help you gain further skills such as website building, producing audio and video, and creating revenue streams in your own multimedia environment. Because Vinnie supports such a wide range of people in the truth movement, he is not government or corporate backed and relies entirely on your donations. Give now, give generously, or subscribe for $10 a month for access to ad-free video archives. Just visit thevinnieeastwoodshow.com and click donate.
Has a very destructive effect. Ryan will get into this a little bit later, but the Bible has a really destructive effect in that it brings sociopaths into a kind of justification for violence. When you look at our history in a broad stroke, you can see this is in fact the case, that wherever this religion is, that you end up with these violent wars. And we also believe that the current situation with all of these endless wars in the Middle East, that at the basis of them, you're going to find the Bible. It may seem like there's oil and all these other issues, and they are there. They are real issues. But one of the very fundamental issues is just this false history that the Bible continues to confuse people with. It's sort of like when you put bad information into a computer and then hundreds of instruction sets later, it just continues to misfunction. It doesn't matter what you do. the darn thing just won't put out good data. Our minds are like that, Vinny. We just have so much bad information inside of us that we can't think clearly about how government operates and about the motivations for government.
Computer programmers have a saying, it's called garbage in, garbage out. Doesn't matter what you put into the computer, if it's garbage, you won't get anything good out of it.
Right.
Well, one of the garbage programs or viruses is the idea that God writes books. And as soon as that idea is accepted, what do people do with the contradictions in the Bible? What do people do with the wide range of moral behavior displayed in the Bible? People will do different things with it. But one of the things that happens is this kind of
documentary, and we're going to be putting on a presentation of evidence showing that Christianity was in fact an invention of the Roman Caesars, and that even though it looks like a religion and people see it as such, in fact, it is a propaganda device. That's really what it has been in effect, and that it was put onto the European mind to make the feudal system, which was a system of slavery that the Caesars enacted, have the appearance of being a religious system. In other words, the serfs, which is just another word for slaves, wouldn't rebel against the system because they believed that there was a religious basis for their servitude, that the head of the feudal system, which was the Pope, the Pontiff Maximus, was the representative of Jesus here on earth, and that therefore they had to follow his instructions. The title Pontiff Maximus was just one of the many titles that the Caesars held, and the location of the Vatican, the Palatine Hill, is where the actual palace of the Flavian Caesars was. So you can see that they set up their system of mind control and didn't even bother really to change the title that they held or where they lived. They just put it into effect and told everybody to shut up and obey. So
is this where the term having a Flavian disregard for something comes from?
Yeah, I think it is actually. So this is really what we're going to try to do, is just so look, the religion is obviously fake. We can show it's fake. We can show the character Jesus Christ is fictional, and we can show that the Bible
deification of the psychopathic parts of the Bible that people find it hard to criticize, especially Christians who know from the story that Jesus was a practicing Jew and he revered parts of the Hebrew Bible, and so I mean, there's a contradiction there. If this very model of spirituality admired the Hebrew Bible, and that has very psychopathic parts to it, like genocide, calling for genocide, killing children. It's hard to reconcile that if you think God wrote the Bible. I'd like to see more people seeing that spirituality comes from within. I mean, a book can inspire that spirituality, but to totally externalize it and put it on a book isn't serving this culture anymore.
I've always wondered, where's the integrity, the intelligence, and the forethought to base your entire life upon the writings of a singular book?
Yeah, well, there just isn't any, and it's just bad thinking from the very beginning. The way that was achieved was by stating that the book came from God, and therefore you shouldn't look at other books because this is the book that came from God. But if you actually have a focused analysis of the material in the Bible, you'll see that, as Ryan pointed out, that much of it is literally psychopathic. So this can't be coming from God. It's impossible. It's contradictory. So since the book doesn't come from God, it comes from men. And therefore, your point that you shouldn't base your life upon it is absolutely correct. And it's the only logical way to approach the situation. Just going back to when the U.S. got into this absolute catastrophe in the Middle East, which was supposed to be over quickly and now is led to a point where World War III is literally on the table and no end in sight, of course, to the conflict. If you remember way back when, to 2001, when Bush started all this activity, he used the Bible as his primary basis. Bush actually went to the French prime minister at the time, which name was Chirac, and said that you needed to be part of this war because it was Gog and Magog. Now, Chirac smiled politely and nodded, and when Bush left, he turned to his colleague and said, "What was that? What was he talking about?" He had no idea. They had to go and get a Bible scholar. And this was reported in a number of French newspapers, and I believe German newspapers as well, but it never got into the US media for some reason. But what the Bible scholar told Chirac was, it appears that the American president believes that the book of Revelation's prophecy, which end up with the apocalypse and the population of the planet being reduced to 144,000, that this war in the Middle East is going to lead to the second coming of Jesus and the apocalypse. Now, this was well vetted. In other words, this wasn't just a rumor, but it actually was corroborated in a journalistic fashion, and appears to be true. It was never denied by the U.S. press corps that surrounds the president. And yet it is absolutely clear grounds for removing Bush on the grounds he's insane. But this couldn't occur in the United States.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting episode of the Vinnie Eastwood Show, broadcasting live on AmericanFreedomRadio.com 5 days a week for your listening pleasure. My very special guests today are Joe Atwill and Ryan Gilmore, and we're going to be talking about Christianity and how it was an invented technique of mind control in and of itself. Joe Atwill is the producer and author of Caesar's Messiah. As a youth in Japan, Atwill attended a Jesuit military academy where most of the school day was spent studying Greek, Latin, and the Bible. In later years, he continued studying hundreds of books on the origins of Christianity, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. Together with Robert Eisman, Atwill wrote a paper on the actual dating of the scrolls. Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus, was published by Ulysses Press in 2006, becoming the best-selling work of religious history in the US in 2007. Its German translation has also achieved #1 bestseller status. So, Joe, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me, and it's good to hear your voice again, Vinny.
You know, I like hearing my voice too. That's kind of why I become a radio show host. And Ryan, also welcome to you.
Hi, Vinny.
All right. So, Joe, if you wouldn't mind launching us off and taking this show where you'd like it to go.
Sure. Well, in the next month, October the 19th in London at the Conroy Theatre, we're going to be putting on a seminar. There'll be myself, other scholars. Ryan will be there, Ryan Gilmore. And we're going to be showing the Caesar's Messiah